All right, everybody, here we are. We're at the third and final video lecture for the week. Today we're going to be talking about divine command theory as a way to know and also use moral value. The goal for this course really is for us to try to identify a universal moral value. And what I mean by universal moral value is that it applies to everybody in all times, in all places, in all situations, regardless of circumstance, right? We want a way of evaluating if something is good or not. Our way of doing that is by having a universal moral value, seemingly. So we're going to be discussing that a lot. Religion has a lot to say about this, obviously. Divine command theory and natural law are only two, there are only two options among a lot, like I said. But they present ways of finding and applying so-called universal moral values. The reading for this little portion of religion, our religion module, is the Euthyphro dialogue. And the Euthyphro dialogue, it might be a little bit difficult for you to read, certainly harder than probably Martin Luther King's letter. And the only reason for that is because it was written, thousands of years ago in a different language and a totally different style, and for a different audience, right? So the Euthyphro dialogue is part of a series of dialogues where Socrates goes and talks to random people, and he asks them questions about all kind of things, what they're doing, why they think this way, how do we, justify a republic, blah, 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 blah. Does all kind of stuff like that. Plato is the person who is actually writing about Socrates. We don't have anything from Socrates directly. Actually, Socrates never wrote anything himself. So everything we do have about Socrates is from people who wrote about him. And so Plato is one of those writers. So in the Euthyphro dialogue written by Plato, but about Socrates, he encounters Socrates encounters a man named Euthyphro. Socrates encounters Euthyphro basically on his way to a courthouse. And Socrates asks Euthyphro what he's doing, why he's there. And Euthyphro explains that he is going to prosecute his father because his father murdered a man, murdered one of his slaves, actually. Even though the slave had done some terrible things, he had also murdered another person. The way the father murdered the slave was by binding him and throwing him in a ditch, apparently, particularly brutal. And so Socrates feels like this is a good thing to question. He wants to question whether or not this guy is justifiably prosecuting his father over the murder of a slave. So really interesting scene there for ancient Greece, I guess. Yeah, anyway, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us now, obviously, right? And again, Socrates decides that this is the thing that he's going to question. He's like, should you really be, prosecuting your father about slave murder? Come on. So Socrates, mentions to Euthyphro, like, wow, prosecuting your father for this is, it's a big deal. It's your father. And Euthyphro says, well, I know I'm doing right because I'm pious. And Socrates hones in on that, right? He wants to know, what does it mean to be pious? Wow, you're pious. That's great. And by pious, we could translate that basically to mean faithful, right? He is religious. He knows what to do and knows how to do things correctly because he follows the gods. So, of course, his actions are good. Of course, he's doing things based on the correct moral values because he is basing them off of what the gods would do. So Socrates questions him about this a lot, and you should definitely go read this for yourself. I'm not going to go through all these points. So the question that Socrates finally asks Euthyphro that gets him to sort of walk away from the conversation, and awkwardly as well, right? He's just like, oh, well, look at the time, gotta go. We'll talk about piety later, and I'll tell you all about it when we get that chance. So the question that Socrates asks to make Euthyphro have that response: does God command certain moral values or actions? Does he command them because they are good, right? Or are those certain moral values and actions good, and therefore God then commands them, right? Kind of a weird little bit of a tricky way to think about this. So let me unpack that a little bit for you. We have two options here that Socrates is presenting to Euthyphro, right? The first option is that God commands things, and that makes those things good. So if God commands that killing is good, it is good, right? Now that's really broad, obviously, but if God commands that, I don't know, you should meditate, or that you should carry like an ark through the desert, or that, I don't know, all kinds of different examples from religion. If God commands those things, right, they are good because God commands it. That's actually the basic premise of divine command theory, right? But Socrates presents the second option. He's actually doesn't think that that's the only possibility, right? The other possibility is that maybe things are good, and so God commands us to do them, but his commanding is not what makes them good, right? God essentially sees an action or a value as good, and he identifies it. He's like, hey guys, right here, this thing, right? It's good. But him identifying it, him commanding us to appreciate that value or apply that value, is not what makes it good. Now, the problem with saying, oh yeah, God, because God commands it, that's what makes it good, is it makes things seem kind of arbitrary, right? Like my examples, if God commands rape and murder and incest and all those things to be good and like actions that we should be doing, would they really be good? Is that, it seems like if God commanded those things, they would still be bad, right? In fact, we have a lot of religions that where people practice things that we consider to be horrendous, right? Human sacrifice and things like that. And they certainly thought it was a good thing, right? They were doing it. Why else would they be doing it? Maybe it was difficult, but they didn't think it was bad. And they were certainly doing it at their God's behest. And that's not only for like pagan religions, that's Abrahamic religions, that's Eastern religions. We have examples of this sorts of practices that we now kind of all think of as bad, or in modernity we think of as bad. But back then or not back then, but in their specific times, in their specific locations, and following their specific practices, right? They didn't think of those things as bad. And certainly it was because they could justify them by saying, well, God told us, right? So that's a problem, right, with that answer. The other answer, the idea that something is good and then God identifies it and then presents it to us, basically, is that means that there's a source of goodness that is outside of God. And if there's an objective goodness outside of God, that seems kind of sacrilegious, actually, really, right? Especially for anybody who's claiming that the source of goodness is God. It seems contradictory, doesn't it? So there's a problem with both of those answers, and that's called the Euthyphro dilemma. And it's a really old problem. It's been around for a while. And it's something that kind of haunts divine command theory as a source of moral values, as a way of knowing what we should value and as a way of applying those values. So that's, why it's called the Euthyphro dilemma, is because either answer kind of cheapens our traditional ideas of a divine being as a source of goodness, right? So we got some discussion questions about that. Interested to hear what you guys think. Is it possible to derive our moral values from divine commands? Is that, and should that be, the source of our moral values? And if so, how do we deal with the Euthyphro dilemma? And if not, where else should we get our moral values from? How should we find and source our moral values?